Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. Here's your host, Trevor Shayne.
Hey, we are back, and I am here in the studio not only with Dr. Mayfield, but also a good friend of mine and a therapist here at Mayfield Counseling Centers, Shayne Stuart. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
Yeah, it's great to have you, Shayne, and excited for this conversation today.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about a very divisive, dividing topic. It can be, but it doesn't need to be, of race and racism. So at the beginning of this podcast, before we started recording, I asked you, Shayne, whether or not you wanted to be referred to as an African American or a black man. And so I'll ask you again, like, which one do you prefer as we kind of explore this conversation about race?
So pretty much for me, it really comes down to easy to say African American. It goes a little deeper than that, but that tends to be a term that most people can at least identify with. However, on a personal level, I'm good with either African American or black. It just depends upon who's asking, the moment, and if folks are asking involved questions and want to know who I am, where I'm from, and what am I about.
Explain a little bit more about, you mentioned it goes a little deeper than that, being African American. What do you mean by that?
So that would go into my history as far as my parents are from Belize. So that is a Central American nation down in the Caribbean. And so from that, I claim Belize. I would be considered then a Caribbean American. But we also know that slaves were taken not just to Americas, North America, but also to Central and South Americas as well. So we do know that their lineage does come from Africa nonetheless. So I refer to myself as African American because it is an easier one-stop beginning start of the conversation. But to those individuals who want to know more, I can go ahead and extend that deeper into my Caribbean roots.
And I appreciate that. I think one of the things that you and I talk about a lot, Shayne, is just not being afraid to have these conversations with others that are different than us. And I think the hard part is that we've become so, and I want you to speak to this, and this is my own perception, but that we've become so governed by our political correctness that we are afraid to step into these conversations because we don't think we're going to do it right or do it well. And to me, I think that's even exacerbating this idea of racism, the divide between culture and race and microaggressions. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree with that. There is a healthy level of, actually I would say unhealthy level of fear concerning having these type of conversations as opposed to offending somebody and where they're from. But the reality is that there are many individuals out there, I would say a grand percentage of folks that would want individuals to ask them these questions of where they're from, who are they, not what are they. And if we had these conversations and if we had individuals who lend themselves to be more open to willing to step into these deeper waters, then yes, I definitely believe we would have a better way ahead. It became too politically correct, and people are just afraid of asking these questions and having these conversations.
Mark, you mentioned microaggressions. Would you mind defining that for us?
Well, before I go into that, I just want to make sure that our listeners know that, we told you we were going to dive into some stuff, and we want you all to hang with us, because I think if we're looking at making our world, and when I say our world, it's your neighborhood, your world, your school, your church, or wherever you function, your workplace, you got to hang tight with some of these conversations that might make you feel uncomfortable. And there's going to be some things that we talk about today that might make some of you feel uncomfortable. And my encouragement is just hang with that and ask yourself the question, why am I feeling uncomfortable? And do some, as we've talked about in all of our podcasts, then now do some self-reflection, do some self-awareness, not an accusation. None of this is coming across as an accusation. It's just asking all of our listeners to really go, let's consider this, because we're not doing it well, in my opinion, in America right now. So going back to the microaggression question, I actually think that's a good question for Shayne, because I know that as a white man, I might try to answer that, but I don't experience it in the ways that maybe Shayne does. And so I'd love to have Shayne kind of weigh in on that of maybe this question: go back to what Trevor said, what are microaggressions, and maybe what are some of the most common ones that you experience as an African American man?
Oh, no, outstanding. So as far as microaggressions, they are things that are said or actions that are done in an indirect way, whether intentional or unintentionally, towards another ethnic background or minority that tends to put them down in a very low-key way. One of the ones in where we spoke about before that I've encountered was when some folks would come up to me and say, you don't act like a normal black man. And that one, as well as others, definitely speak to what microaggressions I've encountered, that other individuals have encountered in different minorities, not just the African American community. As far as it's almost a put down. It's not almost, it is a put down when you sit there and talk about it, because then what is that individual's view of what a normal black man is? Do they have a negative view of it? Are they falling into the stereotypes? Do they have previous interactions with other black individuals that form their view of what they believe a normal black guy is? And at that point, how am I different from that norm that you asked the question in that respect? So there's definitely very different levels with that. And definitely we should have those conversations, because how easy would it be for me to come to you and say, you don't strike me as a normal white guy?
I know we talked about that at lunch today, and I'm like, yeah, I would sit with that if you were to ask me that question and go, well, what do you mean normal? Like where do we have the standard of normal? And just because I know you, and our conversation, the relationship we've built, at this point I wouldn't take offense to it. But if we first met, I'd be like, where are you going with that? And I think but I don't slow down. I have not slowed down enough until I got into this field and until I've really done some self-reflection to realize the connotations that something like that question has. And one of the things I was going to ask you is, as I'm just kind of going through some of the questions I had about 10 years ago when I was going through my multicultural class and my master's degree program, and really coming to grips with some of these things that I needed to own on my own, and that's, I think, as talking about some of those things like white privilege and that kind of stuff is a different topic for a different broadcast. But my thought was, well, I'm not just going to say anything because I'm going to get it wrong. And that was my initial response, going, I value people. I value the individual sitting across me, and I want to get to know more about them. But I don't want it to be a microaggression, or I don't want it to stick my foot in my mouth and offend them. And so I'm just not going to say anything, which is, I think, if you would agree, was just as bad as everything else we've talked about. So how would you encourage our listeners that really go, you know what, I really do want to get to know my neighbor or the person sitting next to me at work in the other cubicle, but because they're different than me, but I don't know how to start the conversation?
No, excellent question. As far as starting the conversation, of course, if that curiosity is there, if you want to know, I would then go ahead and lean more on that as opposed to leaning towards the fear of not knowing how. Just doing it in an honest, affirming way, and just going up to the individual and saying, hey, can we have a conversation? It more likely would not go well if I come up to somebody and say, hey, what are you? No, but just to actually start and say, you know what, I'd like to have this conversation concerning culturalism, multiculturalism, and you seem like an individual that I may be able to have a good conversation with. Are you open to that? And I imagine that there are many people that, if they hear it along those lines, that is inviting, that is curious, that is an individual that want to know, genuinely want to know where they're from and what's going on with them and their experiences in life from a cultural standpoint, that they'll be open to have those conversations. You made mention as far as part where you would slow down in those instances in wanting to ask, I would go ahead and say that there are many individuals from different cultures who actually need to slow down some as well. We tend, not necessarily we, but there are some individuals I know from African American community that would respond very, very quickly or too fast. Instead of wanting to be able to stop and investigate and want to really listen as to the questions that are being asked.
I think that's good. And just reflecting, so I've known you for going on 4 years. Really just started to become really good friends over the last year. And I just remember some of the conversations we had in the car where it'd be a reciprocal thing. It wasn't just a one-sided thing. And I think being willing and able to dive into that conversation and realize it's a relational, reciprocal conversation. But I know this is something that you've experienced in great deal just throughout your life. And I want, how am I saying this? I think I want to ask the question of, you've told me that you've had to fight 2 battles to really get to where you're at. And I don't know if necessarily the majority of our listeners understand what that means. And could you explain that a little bit of what that means and kind of how you see it from that perspective?
Oh, absolutely. So there's many battles in which I've had to fight, of course, to get here. But the 2 prominent ones from that conversation, for me, is to battle to to not be part of society's view of what a black man is, what an African American man is. If you take a look at how society views an African American male or African Americans in general, it's not necessarily the greatest of positive views. So I had to do battle against that, against the society norms of how they feel how I look according to them. But then I also had to go against some of my own peoples, some of my own African American roots and African American brothers and sisters, as far as them wanting to keep a more separatist type of mentality of us against everybody else. And I have had to fight against that as well. That's definitely been a struggle in some instances, because I've come to a place in my life now where it is more about what can we all do together. Definitely more inclusion, having these conversations, talking more about it, crossing a divide, because there's definitely many, many different divides, and now so more than ever in this heavily politicized environment. But what can we do to come across the aisle and understand each other? I may not necessarily agree with what another person is saying from a different culture or from within my own culture, but I can do my very best to try my best to understand that. And I believe we need a lot more individuals who are willing to step back and try to listen and try to understand and see the other side of it and have different, better, more fruitful conversations from that. So yeah, I've definitely had to go from different sides of the stream with that, as far as society's view of who I am and how I should grow up or what I look like, and within my own culture.
So I really, just to sum up what I'm hearing you say, is for our listeners, is really don't make assumptions. And I think that's what we do a lot, right? I mean, it's not just about race and culture, but about a lot of things, is we make assumptions about each other, and then we base our interactions with that individual based off those assumptions, and that's not fair. And I don't care who you are, that's not fair. No. But even more so when it comes to race and culture, we make those assumptions about your experience or what you had to go through or the fact that you did this X, Y, Z,
Oh, absolutely. When you consider it, just on the surface level, if somebody would take a look at me and they say, okay, that's an African American man right there, but that's definitely not the whole picture. Matter of fact, that's not even a grand percentage of it. I'm an African American male who grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Now, of course, so you consider from what I said earlier on that my parents are from the Caribbean, that brings in that level of culture. But then there's also the culture of from where I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And that's different than what my parents brought me into. And then when you consider there are African Americans in different regions of not just the United States, but the world, they come from different areas and different cultures where if an individual was to make an immediate assumption about a person just by the color of their skin, you're discounting, you're discrediting a lot of what makes that person who they are today. Instead, it would be better, in my opinion, just to ask questions instead of making immediate assumptions on who a person is. I can go ahead and walk up and down the street here in Colorado Springs and make an assumption about another person. Say, so you look like a Caucasian male. You talk to me about what it's like to be in the Caucasus Mountains. That makes no sense because. But that's how it oftentimes is for individuals in minorities. I mean, I can go ahead and speak as far as from what I've heard from other brothers and sisters from the Latino culture, and where that they receive a lot of individuals that say, "What is it like to be Mexican?" when that person that they're asking that is really Cuban. There's differences, there's variances, there's cultures that are important to an individual, and we need to get to a place where we're not assuming about a person, but we're asking them who they are, not what they are.
This sounds super familiar to one of our first conversations on this podcast. Was just that conversations are about sharing information and learning to understand the other person, and not about being right, not about proving a point, but just understanding. And I'm realizing as we're having this discussion and as you're talking, Shayne, that this is true of some of these deeper conversations too, some of these harder conversations of it's not about being right or wrong. It's just about understanding. My goal in a conversation with you is going to be to understand where you came from, what your heritage is, how that makes you who you are.
Well, just being curious. And I think, I'm not trying to insert myself into our listeners' heads, but I'm thinking that they're probably thinking right now, okay, so if I don't want to make the mistake of saying, what are you, or, those kinds of things, what would be a good lead-in question if you're curious about the person sitting across from you and their heritage and their culture?
That's a good question. So for me, of course, that would depend upon how well you know the individual, first of all.
Sure.
As far as strangers are concerned, that individual may not be having the greatest of day of an individual coming up to them and saying, hey, talk to me about who are you and where are you from and such. They may not be in the right mind frame in that moment for stranger to stranger. But if you know the person, I'd imagine that if you came up to them and, just and sat down with them and just talked to them about their day. And as far as then a lead-in question, you actually preface it by saying, hey, I would like to know about who you are and what culture you claim and what culture you come from. I would like to know. I would imagine that would go very well to at least start it that way.
I think that's really beneficial. And I know there's a lot of questions I have right now, and I know we're getting close to the end of our podcast for this episode. And I invite our listeners to come back and listen to next week's episode too, because we're going to continue this conversation. But I think really, Shayne, I'm gonna just throw this out there, and if we need to come back and really come back and continue this conversation at the next episode. But one of the things I hear all the time, and when I teach the multicultural class at the university that I teach at, or I've engaged with counselors in a multicultural conversation, I hear this statement time and time again. And I know we've had this conversation. I know I've talked to others about this this topic. But what does it feel like, or what do you think through, or how do you take when somebody, and I think in some ways is well-meaning and genuine, but says, I don't see color, I just see the person?
For me personally, I've come to a point in my life in where I pretty much find that insulting, because that's discrediting, that's ignoring a part of me, a part of what makes who I am and where I come from. To go ahead and say that you don't see color, then what are you really seeing? What are we really looking at? If you came back with a standpoint of, well, I see a human, okay, good, then we can start there. But as far as seeing color, I would want an individual to see that I am dark-skinned. I would want an individual to go ahead and see that that's part of my makeup and that's part of who I am. And then, you know what, we can talk about that. We can talk about the melanin in my skin and where I don't have to go ahead and put much sunblock on, especially out here in Colorado. I can go ahead and talk about the different shades of blackness that are in different people, and of course the different shades of Caucasian people as well. Some folks, my wife is Caucasian, and she absolutely cannot, as a redhead, she cannot be out in the sun too long because the sun affects her differently than my skin. So for those individuals that have it in their mind to think that they're not being offensive by saying that they don't see color, I would gently say that please see color. Absolutely see color, because that's a part of that individual. And then if you see the color, try to see what makes that individual unique, special, how they see themselves in their own color, where their securities are in the midst of that, because there are some individuals out there that are not secure in their own color as well. But having these conversations can lead to good and great places of healing. So that's what I would say to that, is that no, see my color, see where I'm from, and then ask the questions. We can get longer, better, greater conversations if you actually see that part of me.
So just to kind of sum up this, because I know I want to continue this conversation next episode, but is really, I'm hearing a sense of curiosity. I'm hearing a sense of honesty, vulnerability, but also humility. And I think we lose those things in just general conversations, right? I mean, just about not as deep topics about this kind of stuff, right? But I think those things can still apply. And one of the things that I want to come back to with this conversation about seeing color, it applies to me as a white man too. And I didn't realize that. And I think that's something that I really came to grips with about 10 years ago, going, oh, it's not that it excludes me and includes everybody else. It includes me too. And what does that mean for me as a man, as a father, as a husband, as a white man, and what does my whiteness have to do? And I think that's where we get politically freaked out, because we start talking like that, and you're like, well, you're this or you're that, and I'm like, no, we just need to have that honest conversation. So that's kind of what I've heard throughout this time today, and I really appreciate, Shayne, you coming and just being vulnerable and honest, but really want our listeners to go, this should not be a scary topic to broach. It might take some courage, but once you're in it, it's awesome. It's life-giving. It's stretching. It's encouraging, and we need to have them.
Yes.
And this is the way that the divide is going to be bridged, not politically. It's through relationship that this kind of stuff is going to bridge the gap, in my opinion. So, Shayne, thank you for being here for this one, and we're excited to have you on the next episode.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And thank you for listening. Join us next week as we continue this conversation around race and racism, and dig a little bit deeper into these conversations.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/Candid Conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.